everybody. Thank you for joining us in this chat cafe. Today, we are going to be discussing, as our introduction video shows, we're going to be speaking about homeless population within the marginalized groups. And we are going to focus on the youth homeless population. And before we continue in our discussion today, I want to introduce my colleagues who are part of the post-diploma and bridging program on the RN program at Ryerson. With me today is Emily.
Hi everyone, my name is Emily Phillips and I work in post-op recovery.
We also have Lauren.
Hi, my name is Lauren Maligers and I work in the community health setting.
We also have Lindsay with us.
Hi everyone, my name is Lindsay LeBeau and I work on the postpartum unit at my hospital in the family birthing unit.
My name is Ruben Rodriguez. I work in an acute care hospital, and I'm going to be serving as a facilitator for the team today to be able to go through this chat cafe. I hope that you guys can follow with us and enjoy this very important topic to the community nursing. And before we continue, we want you to watch with us this video about a young fellow in Toronto who is homeless in the street of Toronto. And we're going to see a little bit of what his life is like on a regular day. And we're going to be basing our discussion on his experience. So we want you to take a couple of minutes to watch with us the story of Rabbit.
I know I'm gonna feel sick tomorrow. And I don't want to feel sick anymore. It's too hard, it's really embarrassing. It's not like I'm alone, I'm at a shelter. And you don't want to really appear weak in the shelter because kids take advantage of that. My use became more rampant and more frequent. And because of that, my methadone isn't effective. So I'm going through withdrawal even though I'm on an opiate. It's just not sitting on my opiate receptors well enough. So I wake up in the morning nauseated, I have cramps, muscle spasms, hallucinations, flashbacks. Insomnia, but extreme fatigue. If you can think of a symptom, it comes with withdrawal. We're about to start panhandling. Hopefully it goes quick, like it's 1 o'clock, a little later than I like to start. I could not do this, but I want to score, so. It's just on my mind. It's been on my mind for days. Hopefully it goes smoothly today. No cops, hopefully. They always kick you off the corner, give you tickets for panhandling. They call it soliciting or aggressive panhandling, which is a joke. Sometimes I'll have a sign. I generally don't say much unless people strike up conversation with me. Overall, like what I'm doing, like I'm begging, I'm asking for help, and I don't like it. Of course, I would prefer to be somewhere else, but this is what I gotta do for now. When I was younger, I didn't care. I didn't care what people thought of me. I would panhandle, squeegee all day, every day, and it didn't bother me at all. But now it bothers me. I'm just more sensitive to what people think of me. So, I don't like when people shake their head at me. It's just this overwhelming disapproval of what I'm doing. And it's like, so fucking what? Are you gonna take me in? No. So, I want better for myself. I want a career. I don't want to be a career homeless person. I want to have a family. I want to have a partner. I want to have kids. I want a life. What I have now isn't much of a life. But I gotta get back to work. got 10 bucks to make, and then we'll be out of here. I did it. Oh my gosh, I'm so tired. I'm so strung out. Let's just go get some dope. I just picked up and I used, and I went from feeling terrible, irritable, anxious, frustrated to normal, blissful, happy. I really hope I can find something in life that makes me feel this good. My dopamine's running at like 700%. I'm content with everything in my life right now. My life's kind of a shit, like chaotic mess. But when I'm on heroin, it doesn't bother me. I should stop saying heroin because I don't use that anymore. I use fentanyl. Fentanyl's 50 times stronger than heroin. And it's the reason I'm back on the street. My parents let me come home after I was hitchhiking, after I got sexually assaulted in BC. And I ended up stealing all of my dad's fentanyl patches and smoked them all, knowing that he would go through withdrawal or be in pain from his injury. But I couldn't help myself. I'm mentioning this because I want you guys to kind of grasp what kind of pull addiction actually has on someone, that they could betray their own father. When they gave them a chance after years to come home and start fresh, and I blew it. He didn't talk to me for a year, and now we barely talk. And when we do, it's just about my addiction. I feel better though. For now. I don't know what tomorrow's gonna be like. I might try and make more money down here because I want to get more. It's never enough. I don't know how I'm gonna get off the needle. I don't. But I'm tired of running. I'm tired of being afraid.
I hope you enjoyed this video, and for us, when we were planning our chat discussion, it was very eye-opening to see the reality of a young person who lived as a homeless on the street of Toronto, which touched very close to home as myself, I live in Toronto, and Emily, Lindsay, and Lauren are very familiar with the city themselves. So before we move forward, we want to bring your attention what homeless is. Before we move further into the discussion. And when we were doing our research, we found multiple definitions for homelessness. And the one that really struck with us and stayed closer to us was the one that we're sharing with you right now on the screen. I speak about, describe homeless as a situation of an individual, a family that doesn't have a stable or permanent housing and doesn't have an immediate way of really coming out of this situation for lack of affordable or appropriate housing or the financial means to be able to resolve this situation. So we want to use this concept as a basis for our discussion today. And I want to use the help of my colleagues here today to see how homeless is really divided or classified, for that matter, so that you can really understand what homeless is. Because homelessness speaks about the situation of the individual, but there are different aspects of this situation, and because of it is classified in different modes. So I'm going to let one of my colleagues share this with you.
Thank you, Ruben. I'll delve into a few classifications. So I actually have two sets because there's many different classifications and definitions out there. But I'll start with these two. So the first set of four starts with episodic. This is periods of homelessness. Second is situational. So that means a life event such as fire or a violent situation results in somebody being homeless. The third is seasonal. We live in Ontario and it gets quite cold in the winter. So people have to seek or go home to shelters like in the youth population. And absolute, which is somebody living solely in shelters and on the street. The second set of classifications is starts with inadequate housing. So that's a house that does not meet the basic needs. The second is insecure housing. For example, this is squatters, somebody living illegally in perhaps a condemned warehouse, seeking shelter there. The last two are kind of an amalgamation of absolute. So there's houselessness, which is somebody living in shelters, and rooflessness, which is somebody living outdoors.
And how do these appear in Ontario and in Canada, for that matter? What are the statistics significant of homelessness in Canada and in Ontario?
So I'm happy to talk about that, Ruben. So 150,000 to 300,000 people are homeless in Canada, which is an outstanding number. 40,000 are in shelters on any given night. Then we have the prevalence of chronic homelessness. Chronic homelessness is long-term, and that's 4,000 to 8,000 people at a time. And then episodic homelessness is short-term, and the prevalence of that is 6,000 to 22,000. And then transitional homelessness is actually people who are bridging the gap from being homeless to having permanent housing. And that number is quite large as well. So the prevalence is 176,000 to 188,000 people.
Oh, I like when we put this in perspective of numbers, because it can help people really understand the significance of the issue. Before I speak more about the numbers, I want to ask the question for the benefit of our audience. What type of homeless can we say is Rabbit?
So I would say that Rabbit could be, potentially, he does talk about going back home. So that could be episodic. He also leaves his home or is forced to leave his home. So that could be also perceived as situational. But currently he is living in shelters and on the street, which can be classified as absolute, or in the other classification as houselessness or rooflessness.
Emily, I like how you present this, because you actually went through different moments of Rabbit's life or homelessness to tell us what classification was in each period of his life. And that brings me to the question, do this mean that a homeless person can be classified in a different group depending on the moment of their life or the type of homelessness that they experience at that particular time?
Absolutely. So a person can be classified into different homeless categories at all different points of time, depending on their situation. So just because they are going through different situations does not classify them as situational per se. It could be seasonal. It could be the many different classifications that were mentioned by Emily.
Okay, that's very interesting, because one can think that you know, oftentimes when we use classification, once the person is put in that bucket, they remain in that bucket. But I like how you guys have presented the information, that it does illustrate that it not necessarily means that once you've been classified in one particular group, then you remain in that group for the rest of your homelessness experience. So that's very clarified. Thank you for that. And then this ties me to my next question to clarify this. How, and Lindsay, you were speaking about the statistical significance, and I said that I wanted to go back to the numbers. And how accurate are these numbers? Because like, normally when we do research and we go and look at a specific population, we can send surveys to people's houses, we can call them to their houses, or we can go to a workplace and do a research there. But the specific reality of the homeless people with no permanent address and those situational moments that Emily have described earlier, how accurate is this data? Or are people that are outside this data? I don't know, that's more like my worry here, so.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ruben, if I may answer that question that you've touched on there, there is an issue with the accuracy of data with homelessness and specifically homeless youth, just because a lot of the data is qualitative in nature. And when we do have more qualitative as opposed to quantitative studies done, it lacks that validity, it lacks that rigor, and it's not as generalizable. So we can't say that the homeless population that we're seeing in Richmond Hill is the same and generalizable for all of Ontario or for Canada, right? So a lot of the qualitative methodologies tend to be surveys, as you had mentioned, and it does tend to be a snapshot in time. So we'll miss a lot of those classifications that Emily has mentioned, such as seasonal or episodic, just because if it's just taken in one season, homelessness, these either surveys or these different methodologies of qualitative nature will miss a lot of those classifications. And just one in particular that I'd like to mention is a classification called hidden homelessness. And that's exactly as it sounds. It's hidden. It's kind of invisible and there's not a lot of data on it. So what this is it's individuals who are homeless, but they're either living with their relatives, they're couch surfing, they're going from, sleeping in their car to then a friend's house. And it's very hard to get data on that information. And so we'll often miss those as well, because a lot of our data for homelessness is taken from shelters, and hidden homelessness tend to not use shelters as much, or there's a lack of data there with them.
So based on what you're saying, so we know that there is more than what we can capture at any given time.
Absolutely.
And I like that you mentioned this hidden homelessness. Well, we just have the Oscars on Sunday, and one of the movies that I watched was the Lady Bird. And I don't know if you guys watched the movie, but Lady Bird lived with her mom and dad and her brother. And one of the characters in the movie is her brother's girlfriend, who got kicked out of her house. And obviously at that point of time, a young teenager girl, she was homeless, but this family took her in. So she was crashing at her boyfriend's parents' house. So this would be one of those hidden homeless people that we wouldn't know that existed, but because somebody else took them in, now they have a situational accommodation, perhaps? Absolutely.
Okay.
That's very cool. Thank you so much for that. And I want to go back, I want to focus now on the data that we have on the screen. And I found it very significant that 47.5% of the homeless populations are actually single adult males, and it goes between 25 and 55 years old. What percentage, and this is significant in terms of gender and homelessness, but what percentage does the youth population represent within the homeless population?
So the youth make up about 20% of the homeless population, Ruben.
Okay, so 20% of the global group is the youth population.
Right.
Okay, very good. I want to speak because we spoke about the concept and the classification of the homeless as a marginalized population. At these classifications, how do we see those classifications? Are they used the same for the youth population?
Yes, Ruben, they can be, but the numbers are quite different. So a lot of these kids have left home for one reason or another. For instance, it might be situational,
Okay.
but could go home for seasonally, or it may be episodic. So the trouble with youth, but also for the adult population, is that you can actually be two classifications at the same time.
Okay.
And this is especially true for youth because they tend to be in between being homeless and going back home, and kind of until they ultimately settle into homelessness, which is the ones that we're focusing on.
Okay, so bottom line is the classifications are applied to any group within the homeless population.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, very good. And then I want, for the benefit of our colleagues that are watching our chat today, how does someone goes from having housing into homeless? I want to see what is the pathway that an individual take to become homeless. How do that look like?
So individuals can follow different pathways into homelessness, as you were discussing. They're influenced by multiple factors, which can affect a person's chances of becoming homeless. So factors are related to income, employment, housing, and other broad social determinants, which we're going to speak about later. And these can include either separately or a combination of the amount of income spent on housing. So for example, rent.
Okay.
Declines in the amount of new rental housing and vacancy rates for renters, long waiting lists for subsidized housing, poverty and inadequate income, being in a lone parent family situation, which is often associated with low income. And that is also part of loss of employment. That's a big one that we see. And then for some individuals, a really big one is mental health, mental illness, and addictions, which can play a huge role in how long a person remains homeless for. And as we saw in the video with Rabbit, this is what we saw with him as the main focus, the main pathway into his homelessness was his mental health, his addiction.
So what you're saying is that there is no one specific way that people fall into homelessness. There is different causations that lead someone to become homeless, is what you're trying to explain to us, or this is what I'm learning?
Exactly. It's a multifaceted way of becoming homeless, right? There's not just one area or one way that gets you there necessarily.
So when I watched the video for about Rabbit, it seems to me that the reason that he's homeless is pretty much because he has addictions to drugs. Can I assume that that's his pathway?
Ruben, if I may answer that, and as we've seen in the video, that is the focal point that Lindsay had mentioned. But we cannot assume why Rabbit did find himself in this situation of homelessness. We're not sure, if it's because of mental health issues, if it's because of addiction, if it could be due to poverty, or maybe a lack of social support networks. It's not mentioned, but it's at the same time, it's inappropriate to assume why someone has come into homelessness. It's more so, how can we help?
I will add to that. We cannot assume, but we did mention addiction, and the thing with youth population that studies have kind of thrown around this idea is, does the addiction lead to homelessness, or does homelessness therefore breed addiction? So it's not so easy to target a reason, and like Lindsay said, it can be from several reasons as well.
Okay, and so what are those risk factors that are more specific to the youth population that lead them to homelessness? Are they similar to the adult group, or what are the pathways for the youth population?
So I don't mind speaking about that, just continuing on to the pathways. I think that they're a little bit more specific. I'm sure these things could affect adults as well, but I think they really seem to affect the youth, and this is what puts them out there. So physical and sexual abuse by family members, that can drive them to leave their home. Alcohol and drug abuse, that may cause an issue in the home. So the alcohol and drug abuse can either be from the person who becomes homeless, the youth, or their parents having an addiction or an issue with alcohol or drugs. Family composition is a big thing. So is the family a unit? Do they work together, or are they not intact? Do they have dynamics coming from all over the place? They're not working as one. There's something called throwaways, which is a family has thrown the child out. So, I mean, to go back to movies, because you brought a movie up earlier, how many movies have you watched where kids just get kicked out of their house and now they're homeless, right? So that would be the throwaway context. And not adapting well to the education system, resulting in things like suspension. And this just comes down to kids not being able to learn properly and feeling out of their element. This leads to not completing their education. And then something like a criminal record, preventing them from being employed or getting employed, because most people know that once you have a criminal record, it's hard to attain a job. Those are just some of the pathways that lead youth into homelessness.
Very good. And then are the numbers similar in the youth population compared to the adult population in terms of gender, and at the percentage of homeless males is greater than the homeless females?
Yes, Ruben. Actually, whenever a study has been done, the ones that we explored, the majority that were available were male homelessness, and there could be a number of reasons for that. There is a greater stigma with women. There is more violence associated with them, and perhaps they feel a little bit more vulnerable and therefore maybe stay in a bad situation, as opposed to leaving and doing that self-preservation by being homelessness. It's odd to think of homelessness as a way of self-preservation, but they may stay at home when it might be better for their health or well-being to leave.
Right. So this will tag along with what Lindsay was speaking, that a lot of the causation here are related to the conflicts that arise from the living situation within the family. And based on what you're saying, it seems like male youth are more willing to leave the house and escape the situation, despite what this might represent in terms of not having a house. But women tend to be more oppressed and remain in the house and experience these conflicts in the house for a longer period of time, right?
Possibly. Like, it's a supposition. It's hard to gather that kind of data and the reasons why, and it's the reasons are like a rainbow of reasons, right? So it's hard to, I mean, that's a supposition. There's also cultural things too. Men and women are treated differently, and people treat their children differently in different cultures of men and women. So
right.
that could also be a factor.
Okay, very good. Thanks for that. So I like that we move the conversation towards causation. And I want to focus now, how does homelessness become a social determinant of health? How do these affect the youth population?
So Ruben, if I may, I'll interject there. So there are a lot of the social determinants of health, and they do all intertwine and affect, how a youth is affected by homelessness. I'd like to start off by the social determinants of health that I feel really do intertwine together the most, and that would be income and education and employment and those kind of working conditions, because when you have say, a poor education, that can affect the type of job that you will receive and therefore affect the income. So with a lot of homeless youth, there is that risk of, high school dropout. Maybe they didn't get a high school education, and now they're going to seek employment without a fixed address. So that raises issues on obtaining employment. And then when they do, they're at a risk that that type of employment is either transitional in nature, or it doesn't come with benefits, or it could perhaps be dangerous work for cash, right? So we have those working conditions and that income and social status kind of all playing together because of that educational gap, or perhaps, their hygiene, their lack of fixed address. They kind of all intertwine together. And, poorly educated individuals do have a harder time finding employment.
I will add to that, Lauren, that studies have shown that high income is related to lower mortality rates. So if we switch that, then lower income and lower social status is related to less healthier lifestyles. And that translates into more health issues along the way, less opportunities for people with low income to live healthier lives. So it might be a choice between, do I go to the doctor and take the day off of work, or do I eat? Do I make money so that I, can either pay the rent or buy food? It could be as simple as that.
And just to add to you, Emily, if you look at Rabbit's video, the jobs that he's doing are quite dangerous. It's squeegeeing, it's panhandling, and, he is at risk for, the police becoming involved and getting ticketed, possibly a court order if he doesn't pay those fines. And then squeegeeing, people can perhaps get, violent with him being on the street. So there's those issues as well.
Well, I guess also, sorry, Lindsay, you wanted to say something.
I was just going to add a stat to that. I was just going to say that we actually found a statistic that said that 92.8% of homelessness youth had contact with police. So
wow.
This adds to everything that Emily and Lauren are talking about, that they are putting themselves at danger.
And yeah, actually, Lindsay, sorry to cut you off, Ruben, but
it's okay.
A couple more statistics. Yeah, 62.3 had been arrested of homeless youth had been arrested or taken into custody, and 46.4 had been in jail or in juvenile detention. So, building upon that, this is a big problem, and therefore translates into poverty and income and social status and employment ultimately.
And sorry, all of this is very enlightening, so I don't mind that you guys cut me off. What I was going to say when Lauren was talking about Rabbit working on the street, the video, it shows that it was very windy and rather cold, so we can also think of the physical environment itself, the way that they expose themselves, especially, Emily, you were saying earlier, we live in Ontario and we get seasonally, it gets really cold, so the effects of the physical environment that can also have on the health of these individuals kind of pop in my head based on the conversation that that Lauren started by bringing us back into Rabbit's story. From the video itself, we cannot learn if gender or culture make a difference on Rabbit's story. But does gender and culture and biology, genetic endowment also plays an implication here for youth homeless?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So to touch on biology and genetic endowment, there are relationships between mental health and homelessness, and we will discuss that later. So predispositions to mental health issues, there's a predisposition, and then there's environmental factors, and then potentially social factors. So, and usually it's a great deal of stress that can bring on a predisposition to mental illness. And being homeless, or what led you to be homeless, can be a big source of stress and potentially lead to a mental health issue, which can in turn increase the likelihood that you will stay homeless. And for gender and different cultures, what we do know is that there is greater stigma out there for females, but especially for those of different, that have identify with, that are, either gay or bisexual or transgender. Sorry, I misspoke. And the statistics on that is that it's a greater risk for them. So, I mean, and in different cultures as well, people may target them. It may be just a completely different experience. Again, like we had mentioned before, it's really tough to research those things, especially since we can't, establish how many homeless people there are in the first place. But those are definite issues.
Very good, and I can appreciate that, because I often, when I drive, and before we did the discussions and read the notes for our chat, on my way to work, I often cross paths with a young lady that she asked for money on the same corner every morning. And before the course, I guess I was a little bit judgy, because I was like, you look young and clean and well put together. Why don't you get a job? And then sometimes we take for granted all the situations that might lead someone into that specific struggle of having to be hand paddling on the street and asking for money at a red light when it's a cold morning. And so I have a different view on that, and I can appreciate for what you're saying. But how does personal health and coping skills affect the youth, specifically the homeless youth?
So, I mean, coping skills that are common for homeless youth is disengagement. So that means that they just kind of try and remove themselves from their situation. And this can sometimes lead to self-medicating, so using different substances to try and get away and numb their senses and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Do you have any other views on this?
So if I may add, just looking at Rabbit's story, looking at his social support, with his father, he had experienced a situation in BC, and then he was brought back home, and then those social supports we were not sure if they were always there, but they were broken, and so that can lead to maybe the coping skills, maybe why addiction was furthered, maybe why homelessness continued to be an issue, and what led Rabbit to homelessness again in the future. So we do see those coping skills being an issue in Rabbit's story as well.
And considering that we are nurses and we are in the, sorry, Lindsay, you wanted to say something?
Oh, I was just going to continue to add to Lauren and Emily, just that this is all part of our social determinants, again, of healthy child development and social support network and personal health and coping skills. So those are a specific social determinant section that we wanted to highlight. And just establishing new relationships are different. There's lack of self-worth, or can I bring to the relationship? So these are other things that youth in homelessness are lacking. And food insecurity and health development is also part of this. So cognitive development, we all know that if you don't get a healthy diet, your omega-3s, those all help a healthy brain. Youth and homelessness, and anyone who's homeless, they're not getting the food, the adequate intake they need to keep themselves healthy. And this all just relates full circle to everything that Lauren and Emily have touched upon in the other social determinants that we've talked about as well.
Well, I mean, and you mentioned earlier that one of the causations, they cannot relate to the education system, and they ended up being a dropout of a school or being suspended. So a child that doesn't receive formal education or doesn't receive an education, also we have a different development from those who do attend formal education or receive education at home, for that matter, right?
Right.
Okay, and considering that we like, we are doing our chat under the umbrella of community nursing, how does health service affect youth homelessness as a social determinant?
So that's a really big issue too, because everything comes back to income again. So there's a lot of income that's required for services. I mean, luckily the government did just pass that youth are covered for drugs now, medication, which that's a really big thing. But up until recently, they weren't covered. So that's great. But what about dental services? So dental hygiene is huge, and you have to pay for that, and people just can't go and get their teeth looked at. So physiotherapy, massage therapy, just all those things that someone who, like myself, I have benefits, so I can go and get that covered, and people need money to pay for it. And you don't necessarily realize that, and these youth don't have it. They don't have the income coming in to take care of themselves. Often they can't find a doctor because they're not available. They don't know how to search for it. Again, there's no communication out there, and there's no services to help lead these youth to the places they need to get help. They have, again, the lack of fixed address makes it difficult to do applications. A lot of doctors like to see the physical address, a phone number, so they can get a hold of you. And just lack of knowledge where services are. People don't know how to access things, and I think this is where nurses come in. We need to get out there. We need to educate. We need to encourage people to go and take care of themselves. And
well, let's talk about what we can do a little bit later. And before we move on, one last point that I want to make here on the social determinant of health. I was watching the local news yesterday. I don't know and it was broadcast nationally, but the mayor of Toronto, John Tory, was yesterday on CTV, and he was speaking about the approach that the city is taking with the unemployment and the unemployment rate in the city. And I found very interesting, and probably because we are working on this topic, something that really caught my attention was the fact that out of the unemployment group in Toronto, 20% of those are actually within the youth population. And the city is taking a stake on this to create job fairs that are targeting employment for young population. And so I like how the reality in the city actually is an evidence of why young population end up being homeless, or how the socioeconomic status and the employment status actually affect them to become homeless, perhaps. Can we, I know that, Lauren, you say earlier that we shouldn't be making assumptions, but I want to make an assumption here. Can we assume that the social determinants of health on this population became an illustration of health disparities? And I give you that to, Lauren, I'm going to give it to you because you said that I shouldn't make assumptions. So what do you think? Can we take this social determinant of health and this reality of these young people as an illustration of health disparities?
So we can't assume, but we do know that a lot of these social determinants of health do play a factor and influence into these health disparities. So, you know, we're talking about physical and barriers, so such as the overcrowding in shelters, right? So a shelter is something that is provided as a resource. However, when we're talking health disparities, then that can lead to, you know, different types of diseases because of the overcrowding. So you have tuberculosis and such as that. So we can definitely not assume, but we can definitely make connections between the health disparities and youth homelessness.
So is there health disparities among, between the general population and the youth homeless population? Yes, not? Emily, you want to take a take on this?
Is there a relationship between youth homelessness and the disparities?
I want, maybe I'm not making myself clear, and let me try this again. Um, we went through all these social determinants of health, and it sort of giving me the sensation that because they experience all of this, the youth homeless population is experience health in a disparity. So I want to be sure if this assumption that I'm creating in my head based on this discussion is correct or not. So does the homeless youth population is experiencing health disparities?
I mean, I agree with Lauren. We can't make assumptions, but when we tie all of these things together, there isn't a lot of advantages to being homelessness. It does create health disparities. It is going to create long-term problems.
I think I'm going to approach this differently because I think I have my answer in my head, but I wanted to make it clear for our colleagues. Lindsay, if I can pick on you now, our classmates might not know this, but Lindsay has a family of her own, so she has 2 young children. Do you think, Lindsay, that your kids living in a household where the parents have an employment and where you, as you mentioned earlier, you have benefits, can we compare you as a household with this level of living, and then those single moms living on a shelter, those 2 group of children, are they experience disparities?
Right. So I think I understand what you're saying there, Ruben. So yeah, I have a 2.5-year-old and a 1-year-old, and I think our lives are probably different. I mean, I am stigmatizing a little bit, but from what I've seen in the hospitals and where I work, it's what I know. I work on a birthing unit, so I see all levels of socioeconomic income status, everything. Yeah, so I mean, this goes to my kids where I was talking about this one time in one of our groups that I have the opportunity to read to my children on a daily basis. And books are something that have just been in my house since I was pregnant. I went to my baby shower, that's one of my friends threw for me. And every person who came to the shower brought me a book and wrote a little message to my babies that I could share with them for their lives. So I've been reading to my kids since they've been in the womb. And that's something that I think that not all kids get, they don't have access to. So I had the books, they were given to me. In the community, people can access things like a library, but again, you have to have a fixed address to have this happen. Actually, my husband and I just recently moved back to Guelph, so we had to go and start up some library accounts in town. And yeah, we had to show that we lived here. You have to prove that you have an address. So if you are homeless, you can't do that. So your advantage for your children is already taken away, and they don't even know it yet.
Okay.
Is that what you were getting at?
That's what I was getting, because I feel that when we were discussing these social determinants of health, it was increasing me this I'm not sure how to not be stigmatizing, but I feel that as a society, this youth population that live homeless and away from from their family are now victims of health disparities, because all these social determinants became now a factor that affects their health. And I like how you present your family, because then you can really put it in perspective how different it can be if you live in a shelter with your kids, or if you live in a house with a consistent income, and how this can make a difference in the health of your kids, who will have a better development because they grew up reading and have access to the library and having access to a consistent family doctor and that sort of thing. That's what I was trying to get to. And I was trying to get to that by making a little bit of assumptions. So sorry about that, Lauren and Emily, but thanks, Lindsay, for helping me out establishing this. And we have talked a few times now about mental health. I want to move our conversation into mental health. The statistical significance of how mental health affect the homeless population is very significant, and some of that data is now on the screen on the slide. And I want to move our conversation towards mental health and addiction, and how does mental health and addiction plays a factor or a causation into making people homeless? How does it affect people?
So if I may touch on that, Ruben, with mental health, you know, a lot of it is stigma, and, you know, individuals don't want to seek that care. They don't want to get that diagnosis. So they continue to live with that mental health issue. And then in terms, so in a youth population, if there's a mental health issue and they don't seek care, they may have trouble learning, they may have a learning disability, then they may decide, okay, I'm going to drop out of school because it's not working for me. And now they find themselves in this kind of snowball, you know, and then now we're dealing with depression. As we can see here with the statistics, depression is one of the highest mental health issues for homelessness. So we've got this kind of snowball effect happening, and a lot of it has to do with that initial diagnosis, seeking that care, and then now if they are now in that homeless state, now it's access to care. Now we have issues getting that diagnosis now that they're homeless. So, you know, there's the coping skills, there's the emotional support that has to do with the mental health in homelessness as well.
And also, I mean, if someone is homeless and is isolated, also like to have a network of support that ensure the compliance with medication, taking their medication, and it will be definitely affecting their treatment, I will presume, right?
Absolutely.
And how, because mental health is a broad topic, and here on the screen we can see that we have schizophrenia, bipolar, anxiety, and depression, but under the umbrella of mental health also falls the addiction. How does addiction affect the homeless youth population compared to the rest of the youth population?
Yeah, Ruben, it's incredibly common, a lot more common for homeless youth to have a substance issue. This increases their risk for suicide attempts, STIs, early pregnancy, criminal convictions, risky behavior, violence, and it can exacerbate the mental health issues that we were talking about. I have a very shocking statistic of the incidence of psychoactive drug use has been reported by the Public Health Agency of Canada as being 95.3%. And of that 95% is 22% were injectables, intravenous injections. So you can see how big of an issue this is. And this is specifically for youth. So this is a huge issue, and this is possibly a way of them self-medicating. Like Rabbit said, you know, he just feels better. He doesn't worry as much about his situation. He's calmer. You know, it's easier to accept. So it's a way of self-medicating. Yeah.
Oh, okay, that sounds very good. Few times people have mentioned now a stigma, and I want to move our conversation a little bit into that, because I think we have touched the mental health and addiction well in here, and we see how addiction really affect the homeless population, because we can see it on the video on Rabbit experience, and how working was not a means to obtain funding for better living, but rather to supplement his addiction, and how addiction also caused him to having to leave his dad's house. So I like how you put in perspective with the data. But I want to, how does what are the misconceptions related to youth homelessness?
So I don't mind speaking about that, Ruben. So homeless youth face intense social stigmas, and this is usually measured using the qualitative studies that Lauren was speaking of earlier. So again, it's not quantitative data. It's qualitative. It's situational. It's subjective. It's not objective. So this is where the stigma comes in. You can't just go and seek the youth homeless. We think that they can't just go and seek employment. They won't go out and just go get a job. Why can't you go get a job? We say. Why can't, and you said it about the girl that you met on the street.
Right.
They choose to be homeless. So, and this goes with that previous comment. Get off the street, go get a job. Why can't you take care of yourself? That they're dangerous. And this is a really big misconception. There's programs in place to help, and but they don't need to go to them, or they don't know how to get to them. Yeah.
Sorry, Lindsay. Just like I wanted to relate it back to Rabbit's story of how he was squeeging and panhandling, and like Ruben had said about the woman that he saw. And panhandlers have said that they face incredible humiliation about the interactions with strangers, and sometimes the authorities, like we had said, relating it back to their contact with police. And I just really wanted to relate that back to Rabbit's story.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, that's very.
If I may add to that as well, Lindsay, you had mentioned violence, and I think that's really important because I think a lot of reasons for individuals, if we look at this on an individual level as to not helping or to kind of ignoring homelessness, it's because, oh, they're dangerous, they're violent, and I don't want to get involved. However, if we look at homelessness and youth homelessness as violent, we'll let the police handle the situation, in which we did see with Rabbit, and that, you know, oh, we'll just give them a ticket, have them handle it. But if we start looking at youth homelessness in terms of poverty, and that these people are in poverty, and that there's been issues that they've faced in their life that has led them to homelessness, we might actually start to consider positive resources and interventions instead of, you know, letting the police deal with that. And so our own individual prejudice about feeling that homeless are violent, or their mental health or their addictions are, you know, I don't want to feed into that, I think are a major stigma and misconception.
Well, and to add to that, we often forget why these people are taking drugs. So they're using it as a coping mechanism for their stressors, right? So in Rabbit's case, he was being sexually assaulted, and that was his out. And then moving forward, there's a link between this stigma and depression. I mean, we read lots of studies of the homelessness who feel they can't go and seek help for their depression because they are being stigmatized in the healthcare setting. So then this just makes them spiral downward even more. It makes them go get more drugs to help deal with their stressors. And then this just makes them have social isolation. It devalues their sense of self. So again, we see why the homeless can't get out of being homeless. The community isn't set up to support them.
And I think, and I'm going to go back to the young lady that I often see in the morning when I drive into work. I think if we, and now I speak in the we as the society, understood better the social determinants of health, the pathway that lead people into homelessness, and how, what are those causations that lead people to be homeless, and how really affects them, because no one wants their health to be compromised. No one wants to have these situations in their life. Even Rabbit say, I have aspirations myself. I want to get a job. I want to have a family. I have to have kids. So I think once we really learn and we understand, then these misconceptions and these stereotypes and assumptions kind of like disappear. And then we are more aware of the problem and really lead us like we need to find solutions, which lead me to what I want to speak next, and is how, as a community nurses, how can we act? What can we do? And I call you off earlier, Lindsay, and I said, let's speak about the implications for community nursing. What are the social determinants of health of homeless youth? How do these relate to community nursing?
Right. So if I can actually just touch on that, even going back just with stigma and community nursing, just kind of focusing on awareness to the public as well as to ourselves, that the resources that are in place, to not be so ignorant as to them as well, thinking, oh, there are shelters open, we're good. You know, there are resources, so, you know, homeless are being helped. It's summertime, so we don't have to do anything. The truth is, in the summertime, community nursing individuals, you know, there's dehydration, there's heat stroke, there's other social, there's other health disparities, there's social aspects. You know, just because it's warm outside does not mean that the homeless are okay, that they don't need those resources. So in terms of community nursing, you know, accessing those resources, making more available, kind of looking at funding and outreach, I think is a major focus that can help there.
Very good. So I'm glad that this is only the beginning of our project together. We have another project to continue and to look more in what can we do as the nurses and what political action we can take. I remember when we, a few terms back for me, when we did current issues, one of the big takeaways for me is that nurses in current health issues, we need to take political action and take a stand. And I think we have to take a stand when it comes to youth homelessness. And a few years back, I have an opportunity to go to the Nelson Mandela Museum in South Africa. And in there, I saw this phrase that I share with you guys now on the screen, that there can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. And I think we can translate Nelson Mandela's view into youth homelessness. And there cannot be a keener revelation as a society that we as nurses have to do something for a youth population and take an activist position to advocate for this population and create opportunities to turn down these barriers that implicate their health disparities and their health issues. So I hope that our chat today has been helpful for our classmates. We are going to be posting our slides to share with you guys. And we have written some notes below the slides that can also help you with your further your learning. I hope that we were helpful to your learning today. And if you have any questions, feel free to put some comments below or posting, and we'll be happy to respond to you. And in this way, continue our collective learning. In my part, I want to say goodbye and thank you for staying with us and listening to how important is homeless youth as a health disparity.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.